Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Impressionism Now, without an exclamation point, but it could have one. The roundtable will unfold over the next hour and a half or so, and I'm very grateful to our speakers who have come to join us. I want to also recognize the Pierre and Tana Matisse Foundation that has supported educational programming in association with the exhibition of Renoir's drawings. I should say I'm Colin Bailey, the Catherine J. Rayner Director of the Morgan Library, and with Sarah Lees, the co-curator of the exhibition, our colleagues in Paris, Anne Distel and Paul Perrin, are not joining us tonight, but this has been a collaboration with the Musée d'Orsay. The exhibition remains at the Morgan until February the 8th, and then in its Paris iteration, we'll be joined by a celebratory exhibition of Renoir's paintings as well between 1865 and 1885. So there's a season in Paris that will be different from the season in New York, but it's an opportunity to enjoy Renoir for almost 7 months. I'll just remind you that the Morgan is also organizing a symposium on January the 30th, a draftsman of the first order, Renoir's drawing practice. Again, this is a program where you're invited to just sign up and come, and this will be a somewhat more technical dive into some of the discoveries and issues around Renoir's drawings that have emerged over the last few years. I feel we are in a sort of renaissance moment for Impressionist exhibitions. And when we talk about Impressionism, as we will this evening, we're really thinking of the advanced artists who worked in painting, drawing, printmaking between 1870 and 1890, so post-Impressionists as well. It's really a movement that captures 2 generations of trailblazing artists who continue to engage us, perhaps not quite to the point that we're visiting the Arte Museum on 61 Chelsea Piers, which has a 3-year collaboration with Orsay from Paris to New York. The masterpieces awaken. I think we can engage with Impressionism still in museums, still in front of objects, still with curatorial, conservation, academic approaches to learn more deeply about these decades. But there has been, it seems, a revival, a reemergence of interest in the Impressionists over the last couple of years, and at the moment, just in a way thinking of this year, exhibitions on Manet and Morisot in San Francisco, Monet in Venice, not very far away in Brooklyn, The Honest Eye, Camille Pissarro's Impressionism at Denver. Last year, 2024, Caillebotte, painting men or painting his world in Chicago, the Getty, and Paris. A model family, Manet's family, in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. A marvelous show at the National Gallery, Van Gogh's Poets and Lovers. Discover Degas and Miss Lala at the National Gallery in London. Mary Cassatt and Her World in Philadelphia. And most notably, Paris, 1874, the Impressionist moment, Orsay and Washington, D.C. And then just to go to 2023 for a moment, Impressionists on Paper, an exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, Degas and the Laundress in Cleveland, Van Gogh's Cypresses at the Met, Van Gogh at Auvers-sur-Oise, The Final Months, Paris and Amsterdam, and Degas on Noir et Blanc at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and Manet Degas, another trailblazing exhibition at the Met. And several of our colleagues from the Met are here this evening. They're very generous lenders, and they are pioneering in a way a new sort of generation of exhibitions devoted to the movement. This evening in our conversation, we will consider new approaches to the subject, both from the Academy, from the museum, and in the marketplace. Issues around connoisseurship and catalogue raisonnés, a desire to have artist correspondence more and more available. Degas is the case. Renoir is coming out next year. And the advances that conservation analysis has made in the field. From the Academy, perhaps a more interdisciplinary approach that looks not only at social history, gender, and race, but also environmental studies, ecological studies. I'm thinking of the contribution of atmosphere scientists for the Monet in Venice exhibition. There seems to be a plethora of approaches and a reigniting of interest. And that reigniting of interest is in large part due to my colleagues who have generously agreed to come and speak to us this evening. So the procedure will be, I'm going to quickly introduce 4 speakers. They will come to the podium and talk about their work in this sphere. We will then reconvene around the table and we will have a conversation. It will be relaxed, I hope, and informal, but it will give our audience a chance to listen to people who are actually engaged in studying, organizing, and thinking about Impressionist artists. So I'm going to go through quickly our 4 speakers in order and then leave the podium to them. Our first is Dr. Mary Morton, who is curator and head of the French Paintings Department at the National Gallery of Washington in DC. She received her bachelor's degree from Stanford and her PhD in art history from Brown. Mary Morton began her curatorial career in European art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. She was an associate curator at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and since her arrival at the National Gallery, she has been a trailblazer in both the display and the exhibition of French 19th century paintings. She's worked on Caillebotte, on Cézanne, on Corot, and of course she was the lead curator in the Impressionist moment in 2024, and she has been awarded by the French government with a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters. Her current writing project is on Mary Cassatt. Speaker number 2 is Jody Hauptmann, who is the Robert Lehman Foundation Chief Curator of Drawings and Prints at MoMA, and a very good and engaged colleague. She received her bachelor's degree from Princeton and her PhD from Yale. Of her many exhibitions, the one that really was a trailblazing and memorable exhibition was Cézanne Drawings in 2021. She also worked on Degas, A Strange New Beauty in 2016, the cutouts by Matisse in 2014, and Georges Seurat's drawings in 2007. She lectures and publishes widely, and she's also an advocate for collaboration between curators and conservators, and has been honored for her support of this sort of collaboration. Professor Andrei Dombrovsky is our brave representative of academe, and he is the Francis Shapiro Weizenhofer Professor of 19th Century European Art at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been at Penn since 2008. His PhD is from Berkeley and an MA from Hamburg and London's Courtauld Institute. He is a prolific author. He's recently published a book on Cézanne, Murder and Modern Life, as well as Monet's Minutes, Impressionism and the Industrialization of Time, published by Yale University Press in 2023. I've been particularly grateful to Andrei's work. He is the author of a large compendium of recent approaches to Impressionism that was published by Blackwell's in 2021. And last but no ways least, also from Philadelphia, Nancy Ireson. Dr. Ireson was until very recently the Deputy Director for Collections and Exhibitions at the Barnes, and she supervised curatorial conservation, registration, and publications. She holds a PhD from the Courtauld, and her subject was Henri Rousseau, on whom there is an exhibition at the Barnes at the moment. She's held positions at Tate Modern, the Art Institute, and the National Gallery of London. Most recently, her exhibition on Henri Rousseau, A Painter's Secrets, is up at the Barnes. She did a marvelous show on Modigliani, on Suzanne Valadon, and her great exhibition of Picasso 1932, Love, Fame, Tragedy, which was at the Tate Modern in 2018. She's also been involved in projects on Toulouse-Lautrec and Cézanne. So I think you can see that we have very, very lucky in our contributors this evening. And with that, I'll ask Mary to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Sarah and Colin, for inviting me to participate in what I think will be a really fun and interesting evening. And I see a lot of colleagues in the crowd tonight and have been advocating that you lob some juicy, barbed questions so we can really get some good conversation going when we sit at the table. So Impressionism, I mean, it just kind of never goes away. Certainly eternally and infinitely popular. So it's always good for museums to have Impressionist shows. But I think it also is a kind of art that comes out of a moment that is incredibly fecund, upsetting, creative, procreative, which is Paris as the center of modernity in the 1860s and 70s. And there's been a lot of really interesting work that's been coming around into the Impressionist sandbox. But I thought the thing that would be most helpful for my part tonight in my short 10 minutes is just to sort of talk about this show that we had, which really was a celebration of the centennial of the very first Impressionist exhibition. So I like the definition of Impressionism as basically 1870 to 1890 and 2 generations. To be most sort of like empirical and succinct, Impressionism could be defined as the movement that exhibited 8 times between 1874 and 1886. So that's just really finite. And we were invited by the Orsay in 2019 at the National Gallery to celebrate the centennial of the very first exhibition, which opened on April 15th in 1874. And we decided, we did the research and preparation for that show over 5 long years, several of which were in shutdown. So certainly in Washington, we had a lot of time to do some very deep research. And we decided to reconstruct not only, to the best of our abilities, what was in that exhibition, but also some of the context for that show, both historical and social, and sort of art historical. And so I'm just going to sort of talk about what some of the things that we learned from that show. It was actually, you think you know everything that there is to know about something like the first Impressionist exhibition, but I will tell you that the curatorial team, which was myself, Kimberly Jones from the gallery, and then the 2 Orsay curators, Sylvie Patry and Anne Robbins, we discovered a great deal and were constantly surprised by the research. So these 2 exhibitions, the way that we constructed the show in Washington was really pitting these 2 shows together. The exhibition, the first Impressionist exhibition at Nadar's studio on the Boulevard des Capucines in the sort of center of the commercial district, not far away from the Champs-Élysées, where the Palais de l'Industrie was showing the Salon that year. So you've got the great official exhibition opening in a grand palace built to show off the latest in technology and art in France. 3,000 works of art by 2,000 artists, all sort of stacked into a series of rooms organized alphabetically. It attracted 500,000 visitors in the spring of 1874. And then you had the first Impressionist show at Nadar's studio, a commercial site, very importantly, a photographer's studio, that new technology, 30 artists, 31 artists, 200 works of art, much more sort of domestically scaled. So that's quite a contrast. And, why 1874 for the first Impressionist exhibition, which is considered sort of very generically in art historical terms to be the beginning of modernist painting. And it's very specific, I think, what was going on in that year and what an explosion of artistic production. And I'm just showing you a kind of, it's a jam-packed slide. All of these objects were in our show, and you've got sculpture, works from the Salon, and works from the Impressionist exhibition, many of them by artists that are quite familiar, and many of them by artists you have never heard of before. And the exhibition actually opened with this sort of provocative provocation of the painting by Claude Monet that was in Nadar's studio, Impression Sunrise. It is the painting that gave the movement its moniker, a snarky critic talking about the insult that Monet is offering to the public in showing what is basically a sketch, a daub that was clearly done in about an hour, he says, and that Monet is just offering an impression. It's not really a finished picture. So this painting was on view at the same time as the Jérôme, which was the greatest hit of the Salon, which is sort of a classic Salon picture, a history painting of a scene from the history of the House of Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu, and very sort of cinematic. But you can see the difference in style, obviously, and in public address. The painting on the left was sold to an American critic, A.T. Stewart, for 60,000 French francs, while the Monet sold in 1875 for about 200 French francs. So very, sort of contrast, just to sort of get the juxtaposition started. We had one gallery devoted to the historical context. 1874 was only 3 years after what the French referred to as the terrible year, l'année terrible, which was the Franco-Prussian War, the siege of Paris, in which the capital city was cut off from the rest of the world for several months and during one of the worst winters on record, and then finally this civil war that was waged in the streets of Paris called the Commune. And Salon artists in particular took on this subject very directly. And so we were able to sort of conjure this moment with works from that Salon of 1874 to kind of give the public a sense of what went down in the environment in which this first Impressionist exhibition was presented. The work on the left by a Salon artist, and then a lithograph that circulated in Paris by Manet of one of the National Guardsmen lying dead in front of a barricade during the Civil War. We had a lot of fun with the line between official art and what was impressionist and radical at Nadar's studio. So I'm showing you a great work by Manet on the left, which ostensibly would seem to be a quintessential classic impressionist work in its focus on fashion, in its bright color, in its sort of sense of modernity. It's called The Railway, and it shows two young women, a little girl and a young woman, posed against a railing, and a steam engine has just blasted by, so the sort of icon of modernity. But in fact, the Manet was exhibited at the Salon that year. So, and Manet never did exhibit with the Impressionists. And we had this painting adjacent to a really classic Renoir of a site of sort of spectacular modernity. This coquette sitting in the front of a balconing box at the Opera House, which really was considered to be the center of fashionable modernity at the time. And she is there to be seen, and of course her partner behind her is, nobody's paying attention to what's going on the stage, and her partner behind her is doing what people really went to the opera to do, which is look at other beautiful women in other boxes, and particularly that fantastic dress, which is definitely fashionable for the time, a little bit over the top in terms of fashion, and identifying her as someone who would not have been a proper bourgeoise, but more of a paid sort of escort to the opera. So the issue of prostitution, which came to a fore also on our wall that was devoted to the icon, the concept of the Parisienne. And following, this terrible year in French culture, there's a way in which the French really glommed onto this idea of the chic, modern French woman as a kind of icon of French national pride at a time when France was feeling really sort of low and defeated, not only by the Prussians, but by this horrible civil war that they had suffered. So you had three artists addressing very directly the idea of who is the Parisienne in this moment. Jean-Jacques Henner at the Salon. This is a very proper bourgeoise, dressed actually very fashionably, but quite respectfully. Renoir in the center. This was a major picture in Nadar's studio of a model wearing a blue dress. This was all about the fact that blue was considered to be the most fashionable color of the day. Indigo had been a very expensive dye, and it had been, they had figured out a way to mass produce a commercial form of blue that was not as expensive. So blue was all the rage. And you have here this model in her blue hat, blue gloves, and blue dress. She's just all about fashionability. And then the Duez on the far right, who was, again, very recognizably a highly fashionable Parisienne, but also explicitly a prostitute, somebody who is doing very well for herself in the sex trade. And she's wearing the most extraordinary gown. And it is the kind of dress that French women might have seen on somebody like her, have gone to their dress designer and asked them to make a dress like this, describe it, but maybe tone it down just a little bit. So these prostitutes were real cultural trendsetters. So two paintings from the salon and the one in the center from the Nadar's studio. There were several artists who were actually in between the salon and the Impressionist group, and Giuseppe De Nittis is one of them. And this is an artist that not everybody is familiar with. He began in the 1860s in Paris doing scenes of modern life, very much in the visual vocabulary of Edgar Degas. So we had these two pictures hanging next to each other. They were, in fact, good friends. And what you see there are three Parisiennes walking in the region of the Bois de Boulogne. This was a brand new neighborhood, and almost sort of photographic aesthetic. Three Parisiennes surrounded by the ultimate fashionable accoutrement of the little dog, and they. This is actually a picture that was refused by the Salon, but it is, he was that year in 1874. He exhibited at both the Salon and the Impressionist show. So he was one of these bridge characters. And then this fantastic Degas, and the theme of leisure, which becomes very central to Impressionism. This is a family that he knew, the Valpinsons, who have been out on a sunny day to see the races, but have pulled off to the site so that the nursemaid can complete the feeding of their newborn child. So it's in fact a painting of breastfeeding, sort of extraordinary in the oeuvre of Degas. I couldn't resist including a slide of one of the great discoveries of this project, which is religious painting. There were some religious paintings in the Impressionist show, namely a couple of scenes of synagogues by an artist that most people had not heard of. But quite extraordinary were the modern paintings at the Salon that were religious. And the picture to the left, Jean-Jacques Henner, this is the same man that gave you the bourgeoise from the last slide. And a fantastic painting of the Good Samaritan that I think hung next to a Manet would have been a really interesting sort of juxtaposition. And then a painter that no one had ever heard of called Dantin. And we had a lot of sort of scholarly and less scholarly conversations about what this picture on the right could possibly be about. But so hopefully, new work to do. And then the issue of the genre of landscape painting. This is a painting by Daubigny, who was on the Salon jury in 1874, and it is, for all intents and purposes, a Impressionist landscape painting, large scale. This picture hung at the Salon, and Daubigny never would hang with the Impressionists, but you can see that the vocabulary of Impressionism, of sort of painting outdoors in a spontaneous way with a highly keyed palette, was existing both at the Salon and was not, in fact, invented by the Impressionists. And then we closed with a room of landscape painting and really tried to define the way in which this movement that starts in 1874 is sort of packaged early on by a dealer who already had been buying works by Monet in particular, but also Renoir and Sisley, called Paul Durand-Ruel. who could see that, that this was the kind of work that, that middle-class people would be interested in purchasing, and increasingly, certainly by the 1880s, that American patrons of French contemporary painting would love to buy. And so he sort of creates a kind of stable of artists out of this movement of Impressionism. And really kind of sells it to America, which is why we have so much Impressionism in our public collections. And so we ended with this still life sort of ending in Le Havre, where we kind of began. And so that is what we did in 2024, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on some of the other work that they've been doing for Impressionism. So I'm calling Andre to the podium. Oh, no, sorry, Jody Hopman. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I just want to also thank Colin and everyone here at the Morgan for the very warm welcome, and also my fellow panelists who are also friends, so happy to be with them as well. Okay. So, in one of the most perceptive texts on Edgar Degas, indeed, one of the greatest texts ever written on drawing, the beautifully alliterative Degas dance drawing, Paul Valéry explains that Degas, quote, takes for an end what can only be a means. Valéry recognizes that for Degas, the means, materials, process, and the conditions of creation eclipse any end product. Quote, nothing, Valéry argues, could be more modern. Valéry's spotlight on methods and materials, his sense that that embrace is forward-looking and convention-defying, all that the modern signifies, has been in my head over these last months as I thought about the questions on the table for tonight. What has been fertile ground for me and my colleagues at the Museum of Modern Art across multiple projects is very much in line with Valéry's observations. Our research and resulting exhibitions and publications that really sought to bring new perspectives to art of the late 19th century. Let me go back. In our research and resulting exhibitions and publications that bring new perspectives to art of the late 19th century, an exploration of materials and process has proved to be essential, a key way into our subjects. So first, a guiding principle and through line has been to illuminate the crucial role of drawings and prints in the Impressionist and post-Impressionist period. Our ambition is to demonstrate that the most radical and experimental aspects of an artist's practice happens on paper, a kind of paper laboratory for the era's most compelling achievements. Our strategy has been to flip the emphasis away from painting and to reintroduce renowned artists that we thought we knew really well. Second, our approach is grounded in close looking, in collaboration with our conservator partners, and these efforts are based on the belief that material and technical choices have meaning. The results have revealed fascinating aspects of an artist's practice, often providing the crucial key to understanding their work more broadly. So I want to look briefly at 3 examples tonight and look really at the level of the mark to see what can be learned from this kind of material investigation. In each, the artist abandons a smooth and lucid contour line as part of a quest to depict their subjects in new ways. So first, just to stick with Degas. In the summer of 1876, it had become clear to members of Degas' circle that he had fallen under the spell of the monotype. And just as a reminder, a few technical images. The monotype, most of you may know in this room, is a work made by drawing in ink on a metal plate that is then sandwiched with a piece of paper and run through a press, and it usually results in a single print. So the etcher and friend of Degas, Marcel Deboutant, wrote, quote, "Degas is no longer a friend, a man, an artist. He is a plate blackened with printer's ink, and plate and man are flattened together by his printing press, whose mechanism has swallowed him completely." This evocative image of the merging of man and monotype is perfect for an artist who is always radically experimental with materials and techniques. Across his career, Degas sought to understand intimately the properties of a given medium, the chalkiness of pastel, the precision of pencil, and he would let that knowledge guide him. But he would often act against it, making it do things that it wasn't meant to do. For example, he would leach oil out of oil paint to make it more like pastel, or he would turn pastel into a paste, or he would step on pastel to crush it into smithereens. But nowhere, we found, was he more experimental, more willing to break the rules, more modern than in his monotypes. So what did the monotypes encourage? Attuned to the slick surface of the plate and the texture of printer's ink, Degas set aside line and contour in favor of a gestural wipe. He set aside line and contour in favor of that wipe, sometimes even close to finger painting, and you can see that really clearly in this work on the screen. And these possibilities turned out to be the perfect way to capture the new subjects all around him. So, for example, the hustle and bustle of the city is captured by these smudged faces that reflect a fragmented and fleeting gaze. Or the sensory experience of industry on the left, or the new electric lights in spaces of popular entertainment. So what we saw was the perfect meeting with Degas and his monotypes, the perfect meeting of subject and means. So second, Georges Seurat. Seurat's fellow painter, Armand Jean, who I'm showing this amazing portrait of from the Met's collection on the screen now, Armand Jean argued about Seurat that it is drawing, this is a quote, "it is drawing thoroughly understood that puts Seurat on the right path." So how did Seurat draw, and what was that path? His drawings dramatize relations between illumination and shadow. We see here the soft glow or halo around figures, or on the right, an atmospheric haze in moonlit scenes, often depicting the edge of Paris. So how does he get that magical effect? He actually brought together a particular paper, I'm just gonna go back, and a particular medium. Virtually all of his mature drawings were made using a handmade laid paper called Michelet that had a prominent ridge texture with hills and valleys. And his preferred pigment was Conte crayon, a solid, greasy medium that comes in a stick, which does not crumble or smudge as readily as charcoal, so it's easier to control. So abandoning the contour line of his training, the artist stroked the Conte crayon across the sheet's tufts. So it captured the hills, not the valleys. And in that way, he devised his own kind of draftsmanship. The emphasis on dark and light tones to abstract and simplify. If he layered the pigment, if he stroked over and over and over again, he could create a range of densities from a translucent scrim, as you can see in the house in this image, to the impenetrable darkness of that of the kind of foliage on the left side. Also, the exploitation of blank paper to amplify radiating light. And the interlacing of lines to complicate space, which you can see, all of that you can see in this image. So he does that all on the surface of a new vision of modern experience. Next, Cézanne. The artist Émile Bernard explained that Cézanne's drawings allow us to, quote, seize the quality of his thought. The manual, tactile act of drawing, moving an implement across a sheet of paper, was a method of expressing that thought, always a drive to deepen and expand his vision. Looking closely at Cézanne's drawings allowed us to see as Cézanne does. In this case, he may have presented a subject, here a bather stepping into the water, but even more, he made perception in all its contingency visible. We can see that in his approach to a simple line, the way it multiplies, repeats, twists, trembles, and searches. So let's look closely at this very modest sheet. A figure seen from behind. This is one of his favorite figures. Cézanne sets aside a clear and a single clean contour in favor of repeating strokes. You can see that the back is formed from elongated S's, and that braided line stretched down from the shoulder, hinting at a left arm. The right forearm is composed of a series of horizontals that are tacked to a little mound that serves as the elbow. The left leg, meanwhile, is a kind of thicket. The body lacks borders, energizing the surrounding space. Is the bather in motion? Is the body planted in place? What we comprehend in these multiplied marks is the material equivalent of seeing, whether that seeing is uncertain, attempting to grasp its subject, or understanding that something may be more than one thing. Such a refusal of contour, of borders, of finality can also be seen in Cézanne's watercolors, specifically in broken lines, most often in blue pigment. So I'll just draw your attention to those, those dotted lines that track the prominent peak of Mont Saint-Victoire. And then if you look at that vessel of water on the left side of the image on the right, you can see that the vessel is made from a series of these repeating and broken lines. So in these examples, whether in the cozy studio or out in the landscape, Cézanne implied the skips and pauses of vision as well as the impact of light. So just to finish, I want to return again to Valerie, who writes, "There is a tremendous difference between seeing a thing without a pencil in your hand and seeing it while drawing it." And I think Cézanne got to something there with this echo of that kind of prominent forehead and his favorite apple, the kind of visual analogy there. But again, Valerie hits the mark. If the late 19th century was a time of seeing anew, an era of changing perception, to understand how artists see, we must understand how they draw. Thank you. Pass it on.
Jody, Valerie here. Wow, wonderful. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this cold evening. Thank you to Colin and everybody at the Morgan for the invitation. It's always lovely to be here, and I spent the afternoon in the gorgeous Renoir drawing show, learned so much, so congratulations to the exhibition. Before I say a few more words about my own research on Impressionism of the last decade or two, I wanted to make a shout out because I often get asked who are the young scholars who are coming up in Impressionist studies. And while I do think there was a bit of a slump there for a while, the field is actually very energetic and very broad. And I just wanted to shout out two organizations that do a lot of online events as well, in-person events. So if you have any interest in following some of the emerging career researchers in 19th century art, they have a network that you can see up there. And then in particular, I think a fairly new organization called Impressionist Futures. They've been around for 3-4 years, of a group of Impressionist scholars, all in their early careers, who are doing a lot of interesting, really, really interesting events on Impressionism online, and are also organizing a conference. So just a thank you from me to them for doing this work. In terms of my own scholarship, for the last 20 or so years, I get up every morning trying to answer a specific question. Why is it that the modernist painting emerges in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. What are the cultural, political, psychic reasons for this massive shift in taste? And in particular, I'm interested in Impressionism and its particular promises and the promises it makes around instantaneity, around the moment, around the power of the moment, the pleasures of the moment, the complexities of the moment, the complexities of experience, of modern life, of leisure time, all the kind of novelties the Impressionist picture introduces do function in a particular political and social context. And it's important to me to excavate those connections. And the couple of projects I have worked on in this regard are particularly interested in the question of Impressionist temporality. At one point, when I was lecturing, a student asked me, Professor Dombrowski, what is an instant? And I paused for a second because I didn't have a really great answer to that particularly simple question. And I started thinking about it some more, and it turned out that around the time when Monet really starts talking about instantaneity, all he was looking for and couldn't find, right, was instantaneity. That one of the most famous quotes in Impressionism, in a letter he writes in 1890 to Gustave Gerfroy. It turns out that those words were really carefully chosen and came out of a big context of discourses and problems around the cultural management of time of his period. And Monet lived a life that shifted from towards a much more regulated form of time that we live today, where we live with train schedules and other schedules, a universal time fabric that was invented in the mid-1880s, where our pulse gets measured, where we know about reaction time and all kinds of other physiological, psychological, technological forms of temporality. All this is new in Monet's lifetime. And the book that I ended up writing called Monet's Minutes, that Colin mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, really studies the connections between Monet's figurations of the moment and those time discourses, and makes the argument at the end that it's really the variety, the plurality of the Impressionist instant that Monet puts up as a counterfigure to this deeply temporally regulated life that industry and modernity produce for us. More recently, also as Colin mentioned, the beautiful Monet and Venice show in Brooklyn, I've had a chance to think a little bit more about Monet in Venice, where it turns out that that painter paints that most eternal of temporal cities by the most stringent schedule he had ever used. So he actually paints all these monuments on 2-hour intervals and goes from one to the next, and Alice writes about this in letters in great detail. So I tried to think about why it is that all these singular evocations of the instant, right, were based on this most bureaucratic of schedules that Monet thought he needed in order to produce them. So this large question of how we can understand time as a cultural form of history in relationship to Impressionism has been a big aspect of what I have been thinking about lately. As Colin mentioned as well, a few years ago, I edited this large-scale companion to Impressionism, has 33 authors in it. It was, open parentheses, one of the more difficult things I've done in my life, I think, wrangling 33 people between 2 covers. But it's done. So, and there are many really, really fantastic essays by our colleagues in there covering global art history, new material art histories, conservation art histories, exhibition art histories, gendered, new sociocultural approaches, and the like. So do take a look. The essay I wrote for it actually thinks through the fact or the word that you've seen so often just now in Mary's beautiful presentation, the Société Anonyme of 1874, which was the name of the group that who organized the first Impressionist exhibition before they became the Impressionists. Well, that is actually French for a company with limited liability. This was only possible for the first time in French history for about 5 years after Napoleon III had liberalized and denationalized the financial system. And they are among the first artistic groups to take advantage of this new financial structure. So, well, I thought there is an interesting thing to be said here about the modernity of that particular financial structure as well that brings about one of the most important exhibitions in history. Of late also, I have written quite a few things around, as I said, the sort of psychic and sexual structures embedded within Impressionist picture making. In the volume here, I thought with my partner, Jonathan Katz, about Basile's early homoerotic Impressionist paintings, and then for the beautiful show on Caillebotte, Peindre les Hommes in Paris that then went to the Getty and to Chicago, we also thought quite hard about Caillebotte's quite unique representations of masculinity and also his male bathers and the kind of reversals. I like these images up in particular after having spent the afternoon with Renoir. Anyway, the particular gendered and erotic meanings of these pictures. We have a photo that's come fairly newly to light of Caillebotte in drag, actually, and in women's clothing from the 1860s. So there are constantly, as the previous, my two previous presenters have already made clear, constantly still new discoveries to be had and new things to be learned about the painters we so admire. This leads me to, again, make a plug for scholarship and the new scholarship that is out there when it comes to questions of gender and sexuality in Impressionist studies. And I just want to give you two examples. A work that Alexander Morrison has recently published on the Marquise de Rambure, who was exhibiting at that 1874 show under a male pseudonym. So there are actually more women painters participating in the 1874 show than we knew. And then on the right is a fantastic recent book by Rachel Mesh about 19th century trans identities and writers, in particularly Marc de Montifaux, who you see here in the photograph, who was a writer, but also a really amazing art critic who wrote some of the most well-known early words about Cézanne, for instance, right? That famous quote that he is the painter painting under the influence of hashish, for instance, comes from them. So again, lots of new discoveries to be made here around questions of gender and sexuality. I don't want to take up too much time, so just a couple of sentences around what I'm thinking about now. And this too has already come up once or twice in the previous presentation. So I'm already enjoying the synergies that are emerging. For a while, I kept stumbling over the idea of Monet's envelope, Monet's envelope, and I'm showing you here the beautiful painting that Mary cares for, right? And just showing you this weird halo that Monet painted around Jean, and what exactly he is secreting into these envelopes that in which he sticks everything. So I started to think, in the way Jody just described it as well, that we really don't have that good an account of what the contour is in Cézanne, the envelope in Monet, right? All those moments where object and figures meet background, and they are the objects and figures start emanating into their surroundings, and the surroundings bleed into the figures. This profound exchange between environment and figuration, and what kind of philosophical and psychic models the painters drew on in the late 19th century in order to blur the line, if you will, of the object so profoundly. So those are some of the questions that I'm trying to wrestle in a new project, but it's just starting. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll hand things over to Nancy.
I would like to extend my thanks, along with my colleagues, to our wonderful hosts. It's fantastic to be part of this, and many congratulations on the exhibition. It is an absolute marvel. I am apologizing in a sense because this is in part a shameless commercial plug. Philadelphia is not a long way away, and we do have a marvelous Rousseau exhibition to see. I am, of course, entirely biased because I'm a co-curator of that show. But I promise you that I will tie this into this evening's theme. Henri Rousseau was an artist I first worked on 25 years ago. And the first exhibition that I was involved in was an exhibition of Rousseau's work that was at Tate Modern, that was at the Musée d'Orsay, and at the National Gallery in Washington. And it's been an absolute privilege, more than 20 years later, to think about the artist again. And I have worked with co-curator Professor Christopher Green, who is Professor Emeritus at the Courtauld Institute, and who first taught me when I was 18, so that was too long ago to remember. But again, it's been very interesting being part of this dialogue over the decades. And many people have asked me what changed in your opinion of the artist over that time. And I think really if I'm going to condense it into one thing, it is thinking about Rousseau as a person. And our exhibition is called Henri Rousseau, A Painter's Secrets, because what we're inviting you to do in this exhibition is sit within the contradictions of being a human being. This is also important for those of us that make exhibitions, because we need our exhibitions to be things that each of you can relate to. And we know from other disciplines, and one of the wonderful things about art history is it touches on many different disciplines, and we keep our senses open to what we learn from other parts of the field. And if you look at things like workplace psychology, we know that increasingly, particularly if we want to reach a younger demographic, relatability is incredibly important. The sense of understanding who we are dealing with, understanding the characters and the interactions. And that, I think, is really important. And it's something that I really enjoyed when I saw the show that Mary worked on, which really gave you that Impressionism, the roots of Impressionism, being so full of different artists, being so full of different approaches. It helps us to see the messiness of a moment and the ways in which people aren't always consistent. Now, Rousseau was born in 1844, and when we start to think of him as a human being, we realize that that's only a few years after Renoir and Monet. Rousseau was born in the provinces, and in many ways has a very provincial character, even though he makes his career in Paris. But he comes to painting later. He was self-taught. He was from a fairly modest background. He had done military service before coming to painting. And so he only becomes a professional artist at the age of 49. So in terms of his career, he is a generation behind those Impressionists that are household names, but he's still that kind of age. But interestingly, I think what you see when you start to imagine that historical moment and an individual within that historical moment is that the work that Monet, Renoir, et al. Were doing really gives an artist license to paint in a modern way. And what we know of Rousseau is that he really thought of himself as a modern painter. And this is a room of the show that looks at community. Here you have a wonderful painting from the Orangerie, and we've worked with the Musée de l'Orangerie on this exhibition, which shows Claude Junier, who was a grocer. Junier was one of Rousseau's neighbors. He was a horse trainer in his spare time. We even know the name of the horse. It really starts to become a story that you can connect with. And if Junier was a grocer and Rousseau wasn't selling work for much money, we can imagine that there are trades of goods and services within this. But Rousseau is working in a very different style to, this is not an Impressionist style, as we would perhaps imagine it. And yet this idea of capturing daily life, of seeing people in modern dress, to seeing these sort of mundane characteristics all make it part of a world. And that was also the world of Third Republic France, a time of political change, a time when the government really wanted citizens to think about industry and leisure as seamless, as peaceable. How do you get beyond the trauma of 1870 that so many people in France had really seen in the most traumatic of ways? I mean, there's no better way of putting it. It is absolutely the trauma of the moment. Also, we can think about how Impressionism gave artists license to be independent. Rousseau owes his career to a thing called the Salon des Indépendants, or the Independent Salon, which was an exhibition that you could pay to exhibit in. So if you were living in Paris in the 1880s, 1890s, you could pay your admission fee and show whatever you liked as long as it wasn't indecent. This is how Rousseau gets an audience. It's also how people like Van Gogh get an audience, Seurat finds an audience. But just because people are doing things their own way doesn't mean it isn't intentional. And I like this moment in the exhibition. These are two modest pictures, the kinds of things that Rousseau might have made to sell to people in small homes. One, you see a very of-the-moment sketch, perhaps made outdoors, with rather naturalistic proportions. In the second work from the Phillips collection, it becomes a Rousseau. He's playing with scale. The lines are firmer, thicker. And Rousseau was very proud of the fact that he had a naivete. He said that Jérôme, one of those artists, again, that we were seeing in the slides earlier, had encouraged him in that style. So to imagine an individual in that world who actually knew people like Gauguin, he knew Renoir, he knew Puvis de Chavannes, they're all in the same city. And the art world is a relatively small place in some ways. So these connections really make a difference. And the Impressionists allow that freedom moving forward, the proliferation of spaces in which you can show, different ways in which you can be a professional. This is, again, just to think about how that then enables art to go in different places. And again, I think that perhaps one of the things that I'm interested in is how do personalities break away from the group. One of the other artists I've worked on quite a bit recently was Suzanne Valadon, who started out as a model for people like Renoir, Toulouse-Lautrec, and actually becomes a painter in her own right. Colonialism, which is in the background of this historical moment, is also encouraging artists to think of different ways of engaging with the world. And Rousseau makes perhaps his most famous works, these jungles, and we were delighted to get a room of these together. But they somehow seem so divorced from what we've been looking at, and yet I think it's fair to say that it couldn't have happened without that. There is this sort of gateway moment, and it is helpful to think about the ways in which artists admired one another and gave each other feedback. We know that, for instance, these works became incredibly popular after the death of Gauguin. The market explodes for Gauguin, and then suddenly there's a market for jungle pictures. So we're far too keen to put things in silos, but when you actually think of biography and in human interactions, we start to see that there are more logical leaps. And here I just sort of show perhaps the most fantastic room of the exhibition that brings together three of Rousseau's most important paintings. The Sleeping Gypsy, a very generous loan from the Museum of Modern Art that has not been in a Rousseau show since the 80s. Unpleasant Surprise from the Barnes Foundation, which has not been in a Rousseau show for more than a century. And The Snake Charmer, a very well-loved and well-known painting from the Musée d'Orsay. All of these works became part of major collections in the 1920s. That was more than a decade after Rousseau died, when he was incredibly sought after. But I just want, in the context of this discussion, to bring your attention to Unpleasant Surprise, that startling, bright white nude in the Barnes collection, which has just been very carefully conserved in time for the exhibition. And Renoir admired this work. It's funny to think of that connection, but when we see the wonderful wall of bathers within the exhibition, it's rather enjoyable, I think, to think of Renoir complimenting Rousseau and him really enjoying that comment. And there is a luminescence to that body, which I do think, perhaps there's some sincerity with the playfulness in this kind of feedback. Other colleagues have also talked this evening about our need to get back to the physical work and that research underpinning, which is so vital to any of this. Even if you have an enjoyable run through an exhibition, the best exhibitions have always got this depth of research behind them. And when you're with works of art, well, you know this, you're here this evening. It's the most magical thing. Take that time to look, to engage, to feel your way. And one of the absolute joys of being a curator is working alongside conservators and actually getting a physical feel for the works of art. I was thrilled to see some of the drawings in the show that I'd catalogued years ago in Chicago with the conservation team there. You just keep learning, you keep seeing new things. This is a very important early Renoir canvas that is in the Barnes collection. And Christy Romano is in the process of taking off a very discolored varnish from this work, thanks to a grant from Bank of America. But you can just see what a difference this makes. And it brings out the immediacy of the painting. When you look at the treatment halfway through, this is in the studio at the moment, you start to see the lightness. There are moments where the paint is incredibly thin. It really reminds you of why this painting was radical, even if these days it's the art of museums and it's well loved and it's well known. And that work continues. I want to just bring my part of this to a close by putting a signpost for a partnership which I was really pleased to lock in just recently. The Barnes Foundation will work with the Courtauld Gallery in the autumn of 2028, thinking about Monet, again as a person, actually painting on the water. Monet had made himself a studio boat, and it's one of the best-loved paintings in the Barnes collection. And at the Courtauld Gallery, there is a painting that was made from the boat. So really thinking about what does it mean to take this destabilized moment? What does it mean to present yourself with new challenges as an artist? This is something that artists relate to in the here and now. And Cindy Kang will co-curate this exhibition with Karen Serres from the Courtauld Gallery, and I can't wait to see it happen. It's going to be a real treat, but thank you.
Can you? Yes, you can. Thank you very much, all four of you. Lovely presentations and very generous. As I think we feel that Impressionism, Impressionist studies and projects are not only alive and well, but thriving, and hearing about projects coming forward. But I did want to start with, perhaps I'll start with André, and then I wanted to ask you about the interest in 19th century French art, in your sense, in academe and in department, in your university, but also in the field. You showed us two websites of very interesting and promising journals online, and there's been something similar for the 18th century French studies as well. What's your sense, though, for this subject as a sort of motor for research and graduate work?
Yeah, thank you, Colin. I do think that over the last couple of years there has been much renewed interest in the, not just in the 19th century, which has always been fairly popular, but in French modernism. But the topics and questions that are being asked are quite radically different than what even, let's say, the social history or the feminist art histories of the 90s and early 2000s were asking, right? So Colin mentioned earlier that there's a big new interest in environmental histories, and that is really a very, very big topic. And obviously Impressionism with its deep thinking around nature lends itself to that approach. There's a big group of scholars, many of them actually behind the Impressionist Futures group, who are interested in questions of global Impressionism and the spread of Impressionism from France almost around the world by 1900, not just by how the paintings were received and bought, in Japan very early and so on, but also how Impressionist idioms were adopted in various national schools from Latin America to East Asia, Australia, North America, you name it. So this has been a very, very fertile ground of studying to think through Impressionism, as they would say, with a lowercase I, meaning as a sort of stylistic ingredient that travels into different national schools and mixes and mingles with different political and national interests in really interesting ways. So that has been a big interest. I think there's a big interest in material studies and conservation studies as well, new interests in gender and sexuality. So I could go on for a while to sort of, but I'll stop here to name the kind of new approaches and questions that are being asked, and I think it's all really quite exciting.
That is very positive and encouraging. I'm going to ask Mary, as someone who has organized a really groundbreaking exhibition. You mentioned it was a sort of 5, 6, 7 year project. The gallery is one of the great collections of 19th century Impressionist and post-Impressionist art. What, if we may ask, what are your plans for the future for that collection?
In terms of acquisitions or exhibitions?
Anything, exhibitions, acquisitions,
yeah. Well,
projects.
in terms of acquisitions, I mean, we're not going to be buying any more Monets or Renoirs, that's for sure. Hopefully some gifts in that area. But in terms of acquisitions, we have been for about 5 years trying to find objects that will expand the stories that we are already telling, and particularly with this canon of Impressionism, which our collection in particular is rich in, but also somewhat limited by. So, our founders were sort of Rewaldian in their taste. So we're talking about the artists that after 1874 and 1876 and into the 1880s that were, in fact, and I do talk a lot about the market, that were packaged by the dealer and sold, but there were many really interesting and edgy artists that did not make it into that stable of more popular sort of commercial products. And so we are looking to the 19th century for artists that people haven't heard of. We have a acquisition project that we're working on right now, very exciting. An object that was actually in the 1874 show, but at the Salon. Just to sort of expand stories, more global stories, certainly, and obviously sort of expanding, basically. And then for exhibitions, I mean, we are going to be working on this Cassatt Centennial. 2026, it is not the centennial of Cassatt's birth, but the centennial of her death. We like to use these major years just to bring people together and focus. So building in part on the work that Philadelphia did last year in sort of restoring the edginess of Mary Cassatt, who I think was packaged early on in a kind of boring box. We have a few other ideas in the
And you're writing
basket.
your monograph is you're writing a book on
Yes,
it.
I have
So
just.
thank you for telling us about that. Jodie, if I may, your introduction was really spellbinding, in that drawing as a sort of, in a way, as a real entry for all of these artists. As would be admiring that at MoMA you've been able to focus on these later 19th century artists. What is your institution's commitment to Impressionism and post-Impressionism, would you say?
Well, I think our role in this field is a little bit different from our friends who are in more encyclopedic collections, because I think the question that we come back to again and again is, how do we think about the modern, or what is the modern? And I think the answer to that question changes so much, even if you go through the list of topics that Andre just mentioned. So we're always trying to figure out how to redefine the kind of central idea for our museum. And so, but related to that, I think this interest in looking at Impressionism or looking at the late 19th century has always been about, okay, what are the kind of fundamental artists, their strategies, their approaches that kind of lead to something that happens in the 20th century and beyond. So we're looking for these kind of these transformational moments, and so the projects that I've worked on and my colleagues have worked on are kind of trying to map those moments that are that lead to something that happens next.
When we had a Zoom discussion a little while ago in preparation, I was fascinated when Nancy I asked Nancy about Renoir. Her museum, the Barnes, is home Renoir Central, late Renoir Central in a way. And I was just curious, as you think about, as we were talking, what are the sort of pleasures and pitfalls of being a custodian of such a wide range of Renoir?
It is a challenge that Renoir can be quite divisive, but I think that the method that Barnes, the founder of the Barnes Foundation, developed was all about close looking. And actually, I think that's what brings audiences back to the artist time and time again, because even in a work that doesn't necessarily appeal immediately, and actually Jodie and I were looking in the galleries just before this talk, perhaps even in a work where the overall effect doesn't engage a viewer, perhaps that's to do with taste, perhaps that's to do with historical moment, there are always passages that have this incredibly beguiling quality, moments where you get the sort of the wiriness of a strand of hair or the softness of a cheek. It is really thinking about painting as a physical act, making art as something that is formal exploration. And the Barnes Foundation doesn't have any labels in any of the galleries. We do have electronic ways of providing visitors with information that they would like through an image recognition application. But really, most people coming into the galleries are asked to look and sit with the work and think about the work. And that, I think, is where Renoir always wins through. And it's a real joy within the foundation to see school groups, to see visitors from different countries just coming back to the fact too that Renoir had that wonderful sense of decoration. So we do grapple sometimes with a lot of negativity, but I think that the positive sides far override it.
But you had Instagram issues with Renoir.
Well, actually, my colleague Martha Lucy had an extraordinary experience with TikTok. There was a live arts event on TikTok, and we were actually taken offline because of the nudes. True story. And in some ways, it is interesting because when you look at censorship online, of course, all the sort of algorithmic bias comes in terms of what is censored. By and large, male nudity isn't censored to the degree that female nudity is censored. Nudes of color are not censored as much as white nudes. So there's a huge amount of internet, bias and many problematic attitudes that have trained machine learning that come out in all of that. But I think perhaps, again, there's one slightly saving grace, is that on some level there's a recognition of the sensuality of these works. And again, that's something that generationally isn't always the easiest to talk about, but Mary was bringing up in a conversation we had earlier, that there is an eroticism to these works. They were designed to have that, and it's important that within the scholarship, within the interpretation process, we don't sanitize it totally. Mm.
Do you, as a group, it feels, as I said, very positive, there are projects ahead. One of the things that I'm always a little defensive about, because I've worked on Renoir among other artists so much, is this feeling that Impressionism is easy, it doesn't require as much effort, it is crowd-pleasing, and in a way it's harder then to, all of you've done this though, to come up to explain the depth of thinking, the resonances, the struggles, and also how a style changes. In terms of your publics, do you feel that there is that you have to be apologetic for Impressionist or post-Impressionist shows?
I mean, apologetic?
Well, I don't feel I have to be apologetic, but I think there has been at times a feeling that this is material that is well known and too well, perhaps overly presented because it is popular. Which, of course, the show that you did about 1874 showed how initially unpopular and sort of controversial Impressionism was. And I'm just wondering if that tension is still something that you have to deal with when you're proposing projects, or when you're dealing with the public, or when you're teaching a course.
I mean, let me just jump in and talk a little bit about how important it is to get. It's a little bit easier for us, perhaps, in museums, because when you get a member of the public in front of an actual artwork by Monet or Renoir or Cassatt or Degas and start to unpack really what's going on formally in terms of color and touch and space, they can have approached that object inured by all of the reproductions that they've seen in pretty coffee table books, but once you really get them to connect visually and open up to the experience of these sophisticated objects, I mean, it tends to crack them open. I have installed a really wonderful gallery of sort of high impressionism right off the sculpture court, and I say to people that I bring in there, I put this here because when people come to the information desk asking for Impressionism, they can find it easily. It's sort of high Impressionism. But the sophistication of the Renoirs in particular in that room and what he's doing with color is you have to sort of explain it, how difficult it is to control that range of palette and those intense hues. And over time, I think they can come to the complications, the formal achievements, and then there's iconographical, which we've been sort of excavating a little bit more. So it's on us to vive the radicalism of these things. It's not that hard to do. You just have to have the object and then try and be a little bit more articulate than I'm being tonight, but try and be articulate.
And I think focusing just to, my role as advocate for works on paper, I think when you focus on works on paper and you really see the labor and the return and the kind of incessant look at the same subjects again and again, when you really bring out that labor is also part of that, I think, that unpacking and getting to the radicality. And, you can see it in upstairs here, where you see, this interest in looking at the same composition again and again. And those series, I think, are so, so amazing and fascinating for visitors to see that it's not easy at all. It's very, very difficult, and there's this struggle and this aspiration and these goals that these artists are trying to work through.
I mean, I think, if anything, I'm always grateful to be able to share those works with visitors, precisely because I think there are so many parallels between the moment that those artists were living in and what we are experiencing today in terms of overload with technology, the world changing at a pace that is sometimes hard to grasp, and the need to find sanctuary in art is absolutely top of mind, and I think is something that, again, when you look to other fields, it's a place that is increasingly urgently needed. When you look at AI, what can't AI do? It's not really great at replacing human creativity. So actually having these works that you can bring people back to and perhaps create a moment of mindfulness is just a gift.
We're not going to take questions because we're not set up for the mics, but let me just thank my colleagues for really wonderful presentations and thoughtful discussion here. Thank everyone who came to this evening. It's cold out there, but it's been warm in here. And encourage you to come back to see the exhibition, and to wish everyone a good holiday season, and reminding them that our exhibition of the Psalms continues until early January. Lisa Yuskavage, the painter who actually we paired with Renoir a bit because she likes Renoir and her figures are in some ways inspired by Renoir, but many other things too. And then the Renoir drawing show, which continues until February the 8th. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.